Okay, let's get started. Let me have your attention, please. Let's get started. Welcome to the University of Tennessee Nuclear Engineering Department Colloquium Program. My name is Lee Dodds, and it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker. But before I introduce today's speaker, I have an announcement I want to make and someone that I want to recognize. As many of you know, that the College of Engineering at UT has recently gone through its 6-year cycle ABET accreditation. In fact, it just finished yesterday. And I'm pleased to announce that our program, which is one of 11 programs in the college, came through with flying colors, which is a tribute to all of our faculty, staff, and students. But we did have one person designated as our ABET leader, and it's Dr. Art Ruggles. He did an excellent job, and I'd like for him to stand up, and let's give him a round of applause. Okay. Now for today's speaker, who is Dr. Anthony Buhl. He is the president and CEO of Energex, and he is also the general manager of the Oak Ridge True Waste Site Facility in Oak Ridge. Tony was a speaker several months ago on a different topic, as you can see in a moment by his illustrious career. He has lots of experience. But most importantly, he's one of our own. He graduated from UT, this program, 3 times, BS in nuclear engineering in 1963, MS in 64, and a PhD in nuclear engineering in 1967. Then he served in the Army, the U.S. Army, for a few years, after which he joined the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. He was at Oak Ridge several years, and then he started moving to different organizations. Let me just list the organizations. After his stint at Oak Ridge, he was at DOE headquarters in Washington. He also worked for the NRC. Then he came back to Knoxville, and he joined Technology for Energy Corporation, which is a local high-tech firm at that time. Then he founded his own company called Energex. After that, he became the president and CEO of Tenera, which is a large consulting firm headquartered in California. Following that, he was vice president with Kaiser Hill, who's the contractor at Rocky Flats, and indeed that's his subject today. He was at Rocky Flats for 10 years. After that, he was at the Hanford facility out in Washington for 3 years. And now he's back in his current job, which I just described a moment ago. We're very proud of Tony. We're glad he's back home in Knoxville, Tennessee, where we can draw on his expertise. So if you will, please welcome Dr. Tony Buhl.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you. It's great to be back in Tennessee, and I've actually moved back here. It's been a long move, about a 2-year back and forth between Denver, Colorado, and Knoxville, but now I'm officially, thank you, I'm officially a resident native again. What I'd like to talk about today is clearly the most impressive D&D operation that's happened anywhere in the DOE complex. Just so you know what Rocky Flats is and about, I'll review a bit of the history in a moment. Rocky Flats, when I went there in 1990, actually I went there in 1989, didn't know what state of the union Rocky Flats was in. I had a call from the head of a company called Rockwell, who asked me to bring a couple of our people and take a look, interview the plant manager and so forth and so on of this plant that you see here by the Rocky Mountains. It's about 16 miles, easy line of sight from downtown Denver. And look at the plant and find out what was going on, because he was concerned. This was in June of 1989. While I was there, almost 100 FBI and EPA agents showed up with guns and raided the site. And I'll get to that in a moment. So it was quite an exciting 2-3 week evaluation. I met with the gentleman across those mountains you see in the distance a week or so later, and suggested that either Rockwell would be fired, go to jail, or both. Well, they replaced Rockwell within 6 months. Fortunately, nobody went to jail, but you'll hear the rest of the story in a few moments. That's how it all started in 1990. I was with a company called Tenera. We were doing a lot of commercial nuclear work all over the country. And In January of that year, a new contractor, EG&G, came on board. And first week of January, 20 below zero, I was asked to come from Comanche Peak Nuclear Plant in Texas and give them a 3-day seminar or lecture on lessons learned in the commercial nuclear industry. So I went for 3 days and ended up living just to the right of the screen on the mountain there for 15 years. It was one of those kind of 3-day visits. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, what's happened to Rocky Flats. As you can see, Rocky Flats is about the size of, for example, Y12 or ORNL, just to give you a relative feeling. That's a view looking in the other direction, slightly to the northwest. And what you see is this no man's land on the right and the bottom of the screen here. This is actually where all the plutonium triggers in the country were made. You can see this area here. When we got to Rocky Flats, we had about 475-ish buildings and structures. We had over 14 tons of plutonium, over 4,000 nuclear weapons parts, pits, and some 40-plus thousand chemicals, to give you a notion. So in this area, all the plutonium work was done, the other manufacturing over in the other area. Well, with that, see if this works. See, it makes dots. Oh, you got to lay the pin down. Thank you. Learn the technology here. There we go. So that's what Rocky Flats looked like up until 1995. From 1990 to 1995, EG&G restarted, which was my job, to go up and set up a restart center and restart the shutdown facilities because of the events I just mentioned. We spent 2 years restarting parts of Rocky Flats, and peace broke out. And we'll get to that in a minute. Well, this is what Rocky Flats looks like today. It is no more. 2 weeks ago, and there's a same aerial photo, and what you see is straw and grass being grown, and Rocky Flats with really no buildings, a couple of trailers here, but since then those have been taken away. There's nothing left now but prairie, and you'll see more of that in a moment. So how did this happen? Show you a few pictures if you haven't seen inside a bomb plant. Many of you have, I'm sure. Just run through these quickly. The kind of things we face, the kind of glove boxes, dealing with plutonium that had been there for 50 years, some of it, dressing out in these very often, this kind of attire, working in these glove boxes where you actually had the plutonium in your hands, brushing the plutonium, draining many tanks like this full of plutonium, nitrate plutonium solutions. This is what the buildings looked like a couple, 3 years ago. This is one of the facilities. But, as I said, and I'll come back to it, Rocky Flats is no more. So what I'd like to do is give you a real blitz, fire hose of the history of Rocky Flats. First, Rocky Flats, 40 years, 1950 to the early 90s, 93 or so, building weapons, supporting the Cold War. The transition was when peace broke out. When peace broke out, I personally went to Commonwealth Edison and spent some time for a few months before we decided to write a proposal to run the site. Cleanup, I've already mentioned, a lot of buildings, a lot of structures to be taken care of. So the real question is, what worked at Rocky Flats that hasn't worked anywhere else in the DOE complex, and to my knowledge hasn't worked anywhere else in the world, that allowed us to take a site down like this in this kind of a short period of time, 10 years. The contractors, there are only ever 4 contractors at Rocky Flats. Dow Chemical ran the site for, as you can see, 25 years. Rockwell, 15 years. EG&G had a short history because peace broke out. They lost the mission. It wasn't clear where this whole site was going. People were sure on the site. And by the way, when we inherited the site, we had about 5,000 employees there. We needed about 3,500, but we had 5,000. And so the first job was to find a way to kindly dismiss about 1,500 people on the first day or so on the job. So it was a tough transition. Kaiser Hill, 2 weeks ago, wrote a letter turning the prairie back over to DOE. That's where it is now. The contract is finished. Kaiser Hill has finished the work there and are no more. The big events, 1950, you all know about the hydrogen bomb. I won't go through these in great detail. Denver Post headline that everybody flashed around said we're building a nuke A plant for $45 million near Denver. There was a major fire there in one of the buildings in 1957, which caught a lot of attention. Various radioactive leaks. People did not know until around 1960 what was happening at Rocky Flats. It was one of those real kept secrets kind of thing. In 60, an aerial photo appeared, much like the one you saw early. And people started recognizing what was happening at Rocky Flats. In 62, you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. Rocky Flats was very involved in the ICBM development. They became the sole source of nuclear triggers for the United States in 1964 when the uranium operations were shipped here to Oak Ridge. Another major fire occurred in Building 776-77 in 1969. That one caught the attention of everyone because that particular fire at that point in time was the most costly industrial accident ever in the United States. And it took a great deal of cleanup, a lot of plutonium escape, major league cleanup, major heroics kind of thing. Some of us, myself in particular, had some kind of a similar experience with much less smaller consequences at TMI, but it was that kind of an event where the tremendous excitement and concern, as there should have been. After that fire, even though the Cold War was still going on, other things happened. Tritium was discovered in Walnut Creek, which is a city just south of Rocky Flats, or a town called Broomfield's. Water supply was contaminated somewhat. There were high levels of plutonium discovered in the soil at Rocky. So you can see things were going downhill. By 1978, there were 3,500 demonstrators at Rocky Flats. Next year there were about 10,000. They actually tried to ring that whole site, that plant, if you look at it. The buildings are about on 1 square mile, and the theory was we're going to hold hands around the site and shut the site down. So all of this was going on. Meanwhile, some 30,000 nuclear weapons are being built, just to give you the kind of drama. Star Wars, Rocky Flats was a big player in the middle of Star Wars. And then I mentioned the 1989, which is the first time I knew what state of the Union Rocky Flats was in. I didn't know about all this past history at that point. After the raid, things deteriorated rapidly. The site was, at least the plutonium part that I circled earlier, was shut down by DOE for safety reasons, and that's the reason I ended up there in the following January and never left for a decade. In any case, at that time, Rocky Flats also was added to the Superfund list. 1990, President Bush declared the end of the Cold War, another significant event. A couple years later, I also put down there was a big trial with the former Rockwell, who was the former major prime contractor. So that happened, and about the same time when it was decided Rocky Flats was needed no more. So in the middle of the EG&G period, it was determined that there was no need in this country for Rocky Flats. We've got enough thousands of weapons and whatever. In 95, DOE did a major study at every site in the United States, had to produce a big document about vulnerabilities on the sites. And this took probably literally thousands of people involved. In that study, which was published, Rocky Flats had 5 of the 14 most vulnerable plutonium facilities in the United States. And one of the facilities was number 1. It was always called the most dangerous building in America. It became a catchword for the press, especially Building 771. So with all of that excitement going on, in 94, it was decided that, and by the way, I actually have some of these historic documents here, the summaries of them anyway, that talk about what the nuclear complex used to be, and this is a summary of the tens of thousands of pages that really says here are the most dangerous buildings, and here are the pictures, and so on and so forth. About that time, some of us, and I have a couple of examples of just the historic pieces I found in my file. In 94, I spent a lot of time wandering around to different companies, CH2M Hill, Westinghouse, talking to folks. A lot of people were interested in Rocky Flats because it was clear EG&G was leaving as the contractor, and it was clear, being so close to Denver and with all the issues I've discussed, that it had to be cleaned up, completely turned back into prairie. So we went around with, I went around, this is a briefing we gave the governor of Colorado called the Colorado Solutions for Rocky Flats, in which we started laying out strategies and talking about strategies for taking down this site. Nobody believed in 1994, 1995, nobody I know believed it could be done. At that time, DOE had a sign almost as long as the wall to either of these walls to the side. DOE had a sign in their office that said, closure in 2042 for $38 billion. That was the plan. It was a nice big sign. What the Kaiser Hill team said was, we can close this plant, and we can make this back to nature in 10 years. And people laughed and laughed and laughed. So, long story short, a group was organized and bid this contract, went through the long process of orals and so on and so forth. And it became Kaiser Hill and Parsons one-on-one, and actually in early '95, Kaiser Hill was announced as the winner of the contract, and that's how all the D&D efforts began. Now what I can tell you is in '95 we didn't know what we were doing. Nobody had the technology or thought process for taking down this many facilities, this contaminated, and dealing with all these problems. And I remember one source we had to deal with in one facility, it was 7,000 R at a meter. Those kind of things, you got to get rid of that stuff. So we had just enormous complexities in some of these buildings. Took us 2 years to. First thing we did was we said we have to show some real excitement. And what can we really tear down? And Cal Waller, who was just a wonderful guy, was a Schwarzkopf deputy in Desert Storm back in the early '90s, 3-star general. He was one of my colleagues, and he said, well, let's knock down a guard shack. Well, that doesn't sound so simple. I mean, guard shack's half the size of this room. What's the big deal? Well, you wouldn't believe. We got complaints because that could have been, this is in the middle of 3 different levels of security fences, by the way. With all the plutonium and so forth. And we got all kinds of complaints about, gee, the guard shack could have been used for the homeless. We could have brought them in. We could have done this. And so we had just incredible regulatory and public issues to deal with for a guard shack. So we said, well, we better step back and think about tearing down these huge, multi-story plutonium buildings if we're going to get this much grief on them. Then we tried a guard tower. And we didn't get it torn down because some society came in and said, gee, there might be birds in there, and if you guys tear down this tower, you could injure a bird. That's a true story, and so we didn't tear it down. But we realized after a couple of years of dealing with the infrastructure problems that we had big problems. This is a picture of the last shipment of transuranic waste to leave Rocky Flats. This are some glove boxes. All of this stuff had to be taken out of all these buildings that I talked about, dozens of buildings that were used to make weapons. Materials were piped into this kind of a complexity. These pipes all had to be taken down. So, in short, what made Rocky Flats work? Why was this able to happen in 10 years for $10 billion as opposed to, you pick the number, for $40 or $50 billion? Well, I would say the first thing was the initial leadership. The team that went in, although as I've already admitted, we really didn't know what we were doing, had a vision. And that vision was, this can be done. Now what I will tell you is that for every person who said this can be done, I used to claim that there were at least 19 people in line who would tell us why we couldn't do it. And so there was a great resistance on the part of everyone. We were totally mistrusted by, I would say, all regulators at that time. State of Colorado had had a running battle with Rocky Flats because of some of the issues I described earlier for decades. The DOE had their own issues with nuclear safety, as you might suspect. And in 1988, something I didn't mention, a couple of interesting things happened in Congress. One of them was the addition, if you will, or the movement, if you will, of the Price-Anderson Act, which applies to commercial plants, commercial nuclear power, onto DOE, which said now DOE, and particularly DOE contractors, can be fined and civil penalties can apply and then go to jail. So we didn't like that part, but that's one thing Congress did in 1988, which didn't have any teeth until about the time we got to Rocky Flats. The Defense Board, if you think about it, really didn't do anything from about 1988, 89, 90. They were forming, they were watching all this. Suddenly, we had this new regulator totally focused on nuclear safety, entirely, and they're still here today, and they're in Oak Ridge, and they're in every nuclear facility, and I'm sure all of you here know about the Defense Board. So the Price-Anderson Act was a major deal to deal with. I mean, they were very bright people, primarily ex-Navy nukes who really knew their stuff. They knew safety. And DOE, having just lived through the Chernobyl nexus, you know, TMI really didn't affect DOE very much in 1979. But in 1986, April 22nd, when the accident happened at Chernobyl, people immediately drew a nexus of that reactor design to N-reactor and the Hanford reactors. And consequently, the Defense Board became stronger and stronger, and the concerns became more and more. So we were dealing with these kind of new initiatives, if you will, on top of all the other things that were going on. But we had leadership. I mean, one of the individual who just stepped down as Undersecretary of DOE, who was my boss at Rocky Flats, a guy named Bob Card. And I've told many people, you know, Bob Card is the most brilliant strategist I've ever worked around, because he's one of these people that, you know, if you tell him it can't be done, he'll have 8 ways to do it tomorrow. And then all you have to do is convince him, let's just do one of those. And so he's a great guy to work with. He was clearly emerged as a clear leader at Rocky. But having said that, there were many other people there making those same kind of contributions and supporting the effort. Another thing that typically sites don't have is congressional commitment. All kinds of politics, as you know, go on between contractors and DOE and Congress and all of that, and Congress approves budgets. But the magic thing that happened at Rocky Flats, partially I think because it was so close to such a huge metropolitan center, Denver, and also the fact that it was in Colorado, which is very, very, very environmentally conscious. The Congress got behind the notion that you have to manage this like a business. And I think Rocky Flats is by far the clearest example of a DOE site being managed like a business. The first thing they did was second thing probably, was to guarantee stable funding. You see, when you're running a DOE site and your budget goes like this, because of whatever happened yesterday in Congress or in Idaho or in California, it may have nothing whatsoever to do with you, but your budget could disappear overnight. It's very difficult for a company to walk in and say, gee, I'm going to take a risk here. You know, maybe I'll get $1 billion this year and $200 million next year, so all I have to do is lay off, 4,000 people, and then it's a nightmare to manage in that environment, that unbalanced environment. So this stable funding really helped a great deal. And it allowed predictability in planning various scenarios. DOE did something remarkable at Rocky Flats, and that is they made commitments not only to support us, as Congress had directed, the stable funding, but they also had the goods and services. I mean, you think about how many thousands of vehicles and trucks and troop packs and all the equipment you need that is at Los Alamos or at WIP or at New Mexico, wherever it is, how do you stage this? Well, obviously the contractor had no real control over this. But DOE made some very strong commitments. The other thing is they put out some huge at-risk fees, which is, again, very unusual at a DOE site. But the way this process was set up was that it could go either way. And you could make money or you could lose money, just like in the real world of business. So to structure this whole process, which nobody really knew how to do at first, into a business construct, and to get the kind of support from Congress and later from DOE was remarkable. The regulators, the regulators hated us. As I said, the Defense Board didn't trust us. The state of Colorado didn't like us. We had nominally 12 regulators there, 12 different regulators. In fact, I counted up the first day we got on the site. I looked at the last 10 months, and in a period of 10 months, the site had had like 1,300 different regulators visit the site, from Washington, D.C., from the state, from all over. But just counting regulatory visits, how many bodies came on site to evaluate or whatever, was awesome. You know, it was just an incredible number of visits. So just managing the regulatory process with 12 regulators, some of whom were worried about nuclear safety, some of whom were worried about birds in the guard tower, some of whom were worried about the homeless, some of whom were worried about the Preble mouse, which became a big deal because we had a mouse that people thought was nowhere else in the country, much like there was a fish here once, I've forgotten, in one of the dams. But it was the same. So you have all these different regulators with different agendas. You have the Department of Transportation. You know, they know how to make trucks of uranium. And by the way, we had a lot of uranium too in those days, HEUN. So we got to the point where they were no longer micromanaging us. One of the problems, and I say this having worked for the Department of Energy myself, is when things aren't going well, the easiest thing to do is start telling everybody how to do things. And certainly in my case, you quickly figure out you don't know how, so it's not a good thing to do. But they certainly supported us. The emphasis was difficult because I said on day one, we walked in and DOE gave us a choice. Either they decided which 1,500 people on the site had to leave, or we decided. And we decided it was better if we decided, because at least we'd have a few weeks. We had a 60-day transition period from the day we walked on the site until the day we were in charge. So in that 60 days, among many other things we had to do, one was to decide who goes and who stays, and that's a very painful process. It also doesn't win friends and influence people. So if you're one of the bad guys and ladies showing up and you got to do that right off the bat, you're probably not the nicest person in town. So you have to go from that kind of mindset initially into a real emphasis on people. And we always talk about this culture change, culture change like it's something really tangible. And it is. But the how-to is extremely difficult. We talked a little bit several months ago about safety culture change. But when you're looking at a situation, we had some 1,600, as I recall, steel workers, for example, on site. We had union contracts with a number of unions. And by the way, we had something like 635 contractors on site. So if you can imagine trying to figure out how do you change a culture with those, in particular with 12 regulators helping you at the outset. We spent 2 years basically after the guard shack incident. We spent the first 2 years basically structuring the infrastructure, rebuilding the infrastructure for safety, rebuilding the administrative infrastructure, the HR infrastructure, all of that. And how do you convince people that what you really want to do is work really hard so that you won't have a job? That's a tough challenge when you're in this situation, because everybody on the site believed, not everybody, but a large percentage of the people on the site believed that any day now the president's going to call and we're going to start making bombs again. That was the mindset absolutely across the site. Technical developments. We started out doing a lot of things. We started trying to cut these glove boxes apart, trying to cut things up. We started out, you know, hammer and tong. Sawzalls were in. We were going to cut all these glove boxes to 1,000 pieces, and of course you quickly discover these glove boxes are highly contaminated, and cutting them up into the sizes you can throw in drums is not a smart thing to do. But by empowering the people on the floor, and the way we did that, by the way, by empowering people on the floor, you get great ideas, because it's been my experience that the people who actually do the work know what all the problems are, and they probably have 4 solutions for every problem, except people generally don't listen. So that communication gap and getting those ideas from those people and rewarding people for those ideas really changed the technology over this 10-year period. And focus on what work had to be done. We used to say, one of my favorite expressions when I first went there after a while was, you know, what we do is we do safety in work if we can. What that meant is we had this great cloud of great words we would say that were hollow, because if you don't walk the talk, nobody cares. And so the notion of switching that around, which went across all of DOE, to a concept of let's do work safely. Let's quit talking about safety versus production. They're not two different things. You know, doing work safely is what we're here for, and let's focus on what work we really have to do. We had untold dozens of people whose job it was to write some document that had been written every year since 1950 or 60 or something. And I can remember one of my first kind of move around the plant visits was with a group that wrote the 5-year plan. Well, the 5-year plan had been written every year, updated for, 40 years. And you looked at the 5-year plan and you said, gee, this is interesting. Beautiful pictures. It has no reality in it, but it's beautiful pictures. So we found better things for some of those folks to do. So the whole thing was to figure out what's going on, because this is a small city. It has 8 cafeterias. It has, its own fire station, its own hospital, and so on and so forth. But like managing a city, but figuring out what's important to do in this city. That sounds simple, but it was very complex. I put this ISMS for any of you who are into DOE jargon, Integrated Safety Management System. All of that turned into the, define the work, look at the hazards, define the controls, and so forth that may or may not be familiar with the motif today. The more difficult part of this was to spread this vision throughout. Well, the folks that had worked as a, let's just say, not to pick on somebody, let's say a welder or a sheet metal worker or pipe fitter or whatever, folks had done that, their fathers had done that, and their grandfathers had done that at Rocky Flats. And that's what they wanted to do, and that they did it well. In fact, if you look at the production record on this site and the quality of the products they produced pre-1990, they were outstanding. So they really knew how to do the thing they had been trained to do and the generations before them had been trained to do. But how do you now convince these folks that what they really want to do is go out of business? Well, we found 2 things that worked very effectively. You can guess what one would be. Money. What we did is we redesigned the job descriptions. Now, if you wanted to stay a pipe fitter, you could do that. However, if you wanted to become a D&D worker, then there were certain qualifications you had to match up to. And when you got to that level, you got a very substantial salary increase. That got people's attention. The other thing is we really said, look, this is a pioneering effort, and whoever does this effort well is going to do well out there in the industry, because believe me, there are dozens and hundreds of sites out there that are going to have to be D&D. There are plenty in Oak Ridge, and it's a whole other story we could talk about someday. I won't today and stay out of trouble. But there are sites all over the country that need lots of D&D. So we convince these folks that, if you go through this and we're successful, you're going to be successful. And the companies that are here are going to take you to other sites, and indeed that's happened. A lot of Rocky Flats people are now up at Idaho. A lot of, you name the site, you'll find big cadres of these people who really were the heroes who made this happen. Stable funding, I've already mentioned. Project focus, defining doable scopes of work. It's one thing to go in and say, I've got 475 buildings to tear down, and I got all these tons of plutonium to ship out and thousands of weapons parts, and all these chemicals to clean up, but it just overwhelms the mind. But actually going to a project management system where, you know, say you are responsible for doing this piece, and we use this thing that, in fact, I used the word today in a meeting downtown Knoxville, the crawl, walk, run approach. We started out by saying, because there was a big pressure, let's get the high-risk stuff out of here first. Well, there's a certain logic to that, depending on what the high-risk stuff is. But if you start dealing with materials like plutonium hydride, you probably know you're going to get a fire, a blue flash. Not a blue flash criticality, by the way. They never had one on this site. But you're going to get a fire. So you don't start with that. You get people who haven't, nobody had done this stuff before, so you start out with very simple. Let's try clean glove boxes. Let's try, you know, let's try these techniques, improve the techniques, train the people. So the first 2 or 3 years, lots of training. Building 779 was the first building, complex of buildings, actually 13 buildings, to go down, and it was an incredible experience to live through that. I walked in what had been my office one day, and somebody had told one of the contractors there, actually one of the major contractors, that their job was to get rid of furniture, because there's no radioactivity there. And I walked in one day and had a beautiful big conference room, nice wood conference room table. And as I walked in, I saw it and sawed up into 3-foot sections, because this company had a job to do, and one of them was to saw my table into many pieces and get rid of it. Also, my safety shoes were the same way. They were out in the dump outside. Let's see, accountability at all levels and incentives at all levels. The project for the last 5 or 6 years put together a really good incentive program. Dealing with big agencies who have big responsibilities like DOE and all the regulators I've talked about is a big job. And what you learn about any big agency or any company, or in fact it happens to individuals, is you really need to learn what their needs are. The classic approach to dealing with regulators is you gang up and you play them and us, and you know, it's my fault, it's your fault. Most important thing here is to figure out who to blame for whatever it is we like or don't like. And we usually call that good and bad. Good means we like it, bad means we don't like it. So that's the normal regulatory game. And that didn't work, and that had been going on for a long, long time. So finding out what the folks needed from their perspective and from their responsibilities was a big, big deal. And this wasn't easy. I'm not saying this lightly. It took a few years. Union support and bonuses for the union. Radical thought. Both of them were radical thoughts to some people. But the unions, particularly the steelworkers at Rocky Flats, really became tremendous supporters and real heroes. I've mentioned this safety strategy of let's do crawl, walk, run. Let's do what's easy first. Let's train ourselves up. Let's understand it before we take on those high-risk kind of issues that we really don't know how to deal with. So let's get trained. Continuous oversight. Rather than have somebody come in and say, well, so-and-so is doing this job down here, and they have this many rad technicians, and they have this many people, and they're going to take down this many glove boxes. We did 2 things. One is we provided continuous oversight so that it wasn't like somebody coming in to watch you. We were there all the time. We put on the same PPE you saw here, and went back and stood around with the foreman and talked to them and said what would work better. And at first you're distrusted. They're thinking, here's management trying to, you know, do something bad to us. And then after a while you become kind of part of the woodwork, and then pretty soon the woodwork disappears, like I said earlier, but you have to watch that. In any case, that continuous oversight helped a great deal. Fixed price subcontracting. It's very difficult to do a fixed price contract when you have great uncertainty. And believe me, at this site we were dealing with continuous uncertainty. Surprises, surprises, and surprises. We had accidents that would boggle your mind. Small ones, fortunately. We didn't have any deaths on the site during this 10 years. A few pinches and a few injuries, but fairly minor. But nonetheless, some of the things people will do as human beings just never cease to amaze me. For example, the first week I was on the site, we had a manager of our paint. We had a big paint shop. We're always painting everything. But we had one of the managers there, or supervisors, get on a bicycle, and apparently one of the tires was flat, according to the review we did, on a rainy day and drive into a chain-link fence. Well, that's not so bad, except he actually broke an artificial leg. He had an artificial limb. And there's nothing funny about this, except here we are running around saying, now, is breaking an artificial limb an OSHA reportable event or not? And so you get into these just crazy accidents, things that would happen. You'd be in a meeting and somebody would come in and say, and this actually happens, come in and say, you know, there's an empty tank that's been empty for the last 25 years since I've been here. It's a 4,000-liter tank and it's filling up with something. And we think it's bad instrumentation. You know, it's the bad instrumentation story. And a few hours later, somebody said, no, you know, that stuff's spilling on the floor and it's really plutonium. And we don't know where it's coming from. And so you get to pull your hair out in some of those sometimes, trying to say, what's really going on, how did this happen, that kind of thing. So you have some incredibly remarkable events happen. The last thing here I said is great corporate leadership. I think clearly it took a lot of vision on the part of a number of companies, CH2M Hill, Westinghouse, BNFL was one of the companies on the team, and others. Kaiser and CH2M Hill formed this whole organization. But it took a lot of corporate commitment and leadership and a lot of risk up front, quite frankly, because nobody had ever done this before. So this is what it looks like today. What that is straw, and they put grass down. And this picture was taken about a month ago. So Rocky Flats is no more. It's gone. And that's about the end of Rocky Flats. Any questions?
All right. Okay. This presentation is now open for questions and comments. Okay, Mario. Wait a minute.
How did you keep the sponsor from pulling the plug while you're spending 2 years implementing a culture change? And related to the same thing, what were your measures to indicate that the culture change is changed and when you have actually changed it to the point that's acceptable to you? How did you know?
Well, the first question is, how do you maintain the sponsorship? Well, we had a 5-year contract. That always helps. So we had a contract that to not maintain the sponsorship, they would have to have canceled our contract. And I don't think anybody was about to do that because there was a great deal of political pressure and public pressure to remove all this stuff from Colorado. During that 2 years, at first we brought in a lot of sort of touchy-feely experts who could measure this and measure that, and that was helpful to get a feel because we needed to know where people's heads were and what their thinking was. But the way we measured it along the way was actual engagement of people. We had, for a good example of that, we had, you can imagine, we had work packages that thick, you know, a couple inches thick about how to go do this piece of work. And what we discovered was these work packages were being written off in one of the facilities outside the PU zone, and in fact some of the people writing the work packages didn't even have the authority to go in the PU zone. So they're writing work packages on stuff and they haven't walked it down and they haven't gotten involvement. So the real measure was watching the folks on the floor, the workers that really do the work, get involved and creating an environment in which anybody writing the work package, anybody doing the engineering, we defined the scope of work, and before anybody signed off on anything, we put this integrated work control system together. They had to go physically walk it down with the RAD technicians and with the workers. And so it was really, it's not something you measure so easily, 1, 2, 3, but it was watching workers suddenly get involved, come up with new ideas, and watching engagement happen. And it didn't happen overnight, as I said. It took 2 to 3 years.
Hey, Tony, thanks for coming. I had a couple of questions, if I can get to them. The first one was something you talked about earlier when you talked about the actual bid. When Kaiser Hill went in '95 in the bid, did they, as part of the bid, put in this 10-year thing? Was that their bid that they do it in 10 years? And what did Parsons say about it? What was their bid? Did they
Well,
say the same?
Parsons never let me read their proposal. But first of all, 1994, the way the site was set up, they'd been without a mission for about 2 years. And DOE had decided to privatize some buildings inside that, if you can imagine, inside that, there were a couple of huge facilities that were privatized to actually an Oak Ridge firm to do some private work in. And those buildings were, unfortunately, highly contaminated like most other things. And so the attitude in the request for proposal had a lot of social stuff in it about what we're going to do for jobs, how we're going to, be nice to people. And in fact, the initial contract for 5 years said you're going to come in, you're going to do whatever you do, and there was a lot of paper stuff in that first contract. And at the end of 5 years, you're going to turn this whole site over with the 635 contractor. You're going to turn this whole site over to DOE, and they're going to just manage the rest of it. So it was kind of it was a bit more amorphous than I described for the first contract. And then this notion, after the items I mentioned, crept in that very quickly that we could do this in 10 years. And so without rebidding, they simply guaranteed the payments and extended the contract. And Parsons, I don't know much about them. The only thing I remember about Parsons is I think there were 8 of us. We used to be called the 10-speed, the president of the company and the VPs and safety and so forth. And before they announced who won, they called us both to Jefferson County Airport, DOE did, put us in a room like this with half of us on one side, half on the other, and gave us all a whole day of training and security lectures and so forth and so on, and said, we're doing this because one of you is going to win. And we're all sitting there saying, why are we here if we don't know who won, kind of thing. And that was my last real exposure to Parsons, so I'm not sure what that came out like.
My other question, since I have the mic, I was at Rocky for a couple of summers, and I noticed even in '97, '98, when I was there were still some protesters. You mentioned the 3,500 and then the 10,000. I just wondered what, with the university there in Boulder, I know that there was some anti-nuclear type ideas there or whatever. What was the total picture? Did it go down? Or
no, but for the first few years, we had. I remember this one guy that wore feathers and painted his head orange and had a drum, and he sat at the gate for seemed like years. But occasionally there would be an intervener, and they never came inside. But they would be at the gate as we'd drive in and playing music or whatever. But it was. Nobody believed we were going to take this site down. And I mean, the public didn't. For example, the university, to give you a university short story, I spent a lot of energy in the proposal preparation period talking to the University of Colorado. I had a lot of friends there in Boulder and ended up talking to the Board of Regents. And everybody in the engineering college and in the business college was real excited because we're looking at like a $7 billion contract and saw lots of research that could have been applied and so forth and so on. But when I got to the Board of Regents, they wanted nothing to do with anything nuclear. So as a practical matter, University of Colorado was never involved. On the other hand, down the street we had other small colleges that were right there and supportive and doing good research and that sort of thing. So it was kind of an interesting dynamic. And as you say, I lived in Boulder for 15 years. It's kind of I call it the People's Republic of Boulder. I mean, it's 7 square miles surrounded by reality. I loved it out there, though, really. And it's very anti-nuclear.
Do we have any other questions or comments from the audience? I have a couple of questions having to do, first of all, first question is, what was the initial raid all about? And secondly, Rockwell, the company actually, it says right there, criminal violations, paid 18.5. What were the crimes that were committed?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to. But basically, what happened, there were a number of reports, and I don't know these to be true or false. I don't know who made the reports or whatever. There were a number of reports. Again, all of this was prior to my first visit, but there were a number of reports about in Building 771 there was an incinerator, and there were a number of reports that people had flown over or whatever and seen some red glow at night, and you know, all kind of rumors about Rocky Flats as burning plutonium in the dark, and nobody knows about it. So there were lots of these kind of allegations going on, as you can imagine. With 10,000 demonstrators, you can get lots of allegations. So that was part of the trigger. When they got into it and they showed up and they did whatever it is the FBI and EPA do, I was there, but I had no clue what they were doing. It looked like a crime scene. They had, you know, tape and rope and all that. There were a number of allegations turned over to the courts, and so this went on for years. And quite frankly, I don't know what the fines were all about ultimately. There were so many different ones. They distilled them down, and in fact, the one about burning plutonium in the incinerator was found not to be true, the initial one.
Okay. Do we have any other questions or comments? Before we adjourn, let me make another announcement. As many of you know, in the year 2007, our department will celebrate its 50th anniversary, okay? So that's not too far away, a little over a year. And we're just now getting organized. We got a lot of alums that are going to participate, but I had to select a person to sort of lead the effort. And fortunately, I did ask Tony, and after he thought about it for a couple of weeks, he's agreed to chair the steering committee for the celebration, which will be sometime in the year 2007. And we're having our first organizational meeting this afternoon. And so that announcement, if anybody has any ideas as to what we should do for this celebration, either tell Tony or me, and then we'll make the plans. And so with that, before we adjourn, let me point out we do have one or two new faces, that we do have refreshments downstairs, and everyone is invited, and Tony will be down there. You can talk one-on-one with Tony and give him suggestions regarding the celebration, or ask questions about the closure of Rocky Flats. But before we adjourn, let's express our appreciation again to Tony for his presentation. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Very good. You did well.
That was quick.
Well, no, it was right on time. You talked about 45 minutes. That's what we want.
Okay, good. Get all this stuff out.